I sat in silence, slicing the salmon on my plate, while Marcus laughed at my cheap cardigan and asked if typing data all day numbed my brain. He had no idea my quiet keystrokes had once dismantled countless dark financial empires and sent dozens of untouchable billionaires to federal prison. The exact moment he finally realized who he was actually speaking to, his entire fake fortune had already burned to ashes. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Addison Bishop. The evening air in Denver carried a crisp chill, a quiet reminder that autumn was quickly settling over the Rocky Mountains. I sat silently at the edge of our long redwood patio table, letting the gentle breeze wash over me while the warmth of the overhead string lights bathed the backyard in a soft, inviting amber glow. This house was my sanctuary. It was a peaceful, unassuming home I had painstakingly built with my husband, Julian, a place where I could completely bury the chaotic, high-stakes life I had left behind. But tonight, that carefully cultivated peace was being thoroughly shattered by the man sitting directly across from me. His name was Marcus, Julian's newest and wealthiest business associate. He filled the intimate space of our backyard not just with his imposing physical presence, but with an exhausting, relentless noise. He was dressed in a sharp, aggressively tailored suit that looked entirely out of place for a casual backyard dinner. Every time he moved his left arm to emphasize a point, he made absolutely sure his oversized, diamond-encrusted watch caught the light of the patio bulbs. For the past 2.5 hours, he had talked of nothing but decentralized finance, his supposedly revolutionary cryptocurrency ventures, and the massive, guaranteed yields he claimed to be generating for his inner circle of investors. Julian leaned forward in his chair, nodding eagerly at every word Marcus spoke. My husband was desperate to secure a lucrative partnership that he firmly believed would elevate his struggling commercial real estate firm to the next level. Because of that desperation, Julian allowed Marcus to dominate the conversation, laughing at his terrible jokes and validating his outsized ego. I remained completely silent, painting a flawless picture of domestic docility. I wore a simple, soft beige wool cardigan, intentionally opting to blend into the background like a piece of the furniture. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, observing the shifting dynamic with trained, analytical eyes. Sitting quietly beside Marcus was his father-in-law, a man introduced to me earlier as Arthur. Arthur was an older gentleman with a sharp, profoundly tired face. He had spent over 40 years as a senior auditor for elite corporate firms before retiring. Arthur barely spoke a word all evening, his weary eyes darting cautiously between Marcus's theatrical hand gestures and his own untouched plate of food. The conversation suddenly shifted when Marcus decided he needed a brand new target to elevate himself even further. He turned his gleaming, artificial smile directly toward me, resting his heavy elbows aggressively on the cedar wood table and leaning into my personal space. "So, Addison," Marcus began, his voice booming obnoxiously over the ambient sounds of the night insects. "Julian tells me you work over at Vanguard Horizon Analytics. Just a basic desk job, right? Punching in raw data all day long. Does your brain ever just completely numb out from looking at those endless, boring spreadsheets?" I kept my gaze steadily lowered, the silver edge of my knife pressing gently against the perfectly seared piece of salmon on my plate. I did not offer him the satisfaction of a visible reaction. "I mean, absolutely no offense," Marcus continued, his tone dripping with a practiced, suffocating condescension. "But I just cannot fathom living such a small, insignificant life. Tell me honestly, has a 38-year-old woman like yourself ever actually touched real million-dollar cash flows? Or do you just move decimal points around on a screen for other people's pennies?" Julian shifted uncomfortably in his seat, letting out a weak, nervous chuckle. He looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, silently begging me to play along, to swallow my pride, and let the blatant insult slide for the sake of his impending business deal. I did not raise my head to look at any of them. I carefully separated a perfect pink flake of fish with my fork, brought it to my mouth, and chewed slowly and thoughtfully. The patio was dead quiet, save for the heavy, expectant breathing of Marcus, who was clearly waiting for me to wither and shrink under his arrogant gaze. When I finally spoke, my voice was smooth, quiet, and entirely devoid of any readable emotion. I did not look at Marcus's face. I looked at the empty space resting evenly between us. "Most ordinary people," I said softly, the words slicing clearly through the tension. "Look at a standard balance sheet and see basic operational revenue. But a truly observant, trained eye might notice the layered obfuscation of capital through offshore holding structures. Specifically, the utilization of synthetic corporate shells in the Cayman jurisdiction to funnel high-frequency arbitrage yields into unregistered bearer bonds, effectively masking the liquidity origin through a series of nested, dark pool transactions known in certain private circles as a blind waterfall sweep." I paused, letting that highly specialized, underground financial terminology hang heavily in the cool night air. It was a complex sequence of words that meant absolutely nothing to an ignorant amateur. But to anyone who actually understood the intricate anatomy of grand-scale corporate fraud, it was a glaring, terrifying spotlight. It was the exact, undeniable blueprint of a shadow empire. Marcus blinked rapidly, his arrogant smile freezing into an awkward, thoroughly confused grimace. He opened his mouth to formulate a loud, dismissive reply, likely preparing to call me a crazy woman, but the sound never materialized in his throat. Instead, a sharp, piercing sound suddenly shattered the stillness of the evening. To Marcus's right, Arthur's face had completely drained of all human color. The older man's wrinkled skin was entirely ashen, his eyes blown wide with a sudden, suffocating terror. His hands were trembling so violently that the delicate crystal wine glass slipped directly from his weak fingers. It struck the hard stone patio floor, bursting instantly into 100 glittering shards. The deep red wine splattered aggressively across the pristine white stones, looking exactly like a fresh warning of blood. Arthur stared intensely at me, his breath hitching painfully in his tight throat, completely paralyzed by the deadly code phrase he had just heard. The silence in the kitchen later that night was suffocating. Julian aggressively scrubbed a spotless frying pan, his jaw clenched tight. The sound of running water usually brought me peace, but tonight it only amplified the growing rift between us. He finally slammed the sponge into the sink and spun around to face me. "What was that out there?" Julian demanded, his voice thick with frustration. Arthur practically had a heart attack, and Marcus looked ready to walk out. I have spent 6 months grooming this connection. Addison, 6 months, and you decide to start spouting some random financial gibberish just to make him look stupid? I leaned against the doorframe, my arms crossed over my chest. I simply answered his question. "Julian, you humiliated him," he shouted, running a hand through his hair. "He is managing tens of millions of dollars. He is going to save my firm from bankruptcy. You could have just smiled. You could have just let him talk. But no, you had to play the smart desk clerk." I let his words wash over me. I loved my husband, but his desperation was blinding him to the obvious red flags waving furiously right in his face. I chose not to argue. I simply walked upstairs, leaving him alone with his anger and his fragile ego. Over the next 72 hours, Marcus made sure his displeasure was known. He took his petty grievances to social media. Julian showed me the posts on his phone with a look of pure agony. Marcus was uploading pictures from his luxury sports car and private lounges, attaching long, arrogant captions mocking low-level wage earners who would never understand true wealth. In every single post, he made sure to tag Julian's business account, a blatant power play designed to humiliate my husband and force me into submission. I felt absolutely nothing reading those pathetic taunts. I completely ignored his digital tantrums. Marcus thought he was dealing with a jealous, small-minded data entry clerk. He was blissfully unaware that my desire for a quiet life was the only thing keeping him safe. For over a decade, I operated as a lead cybercrime investigator for a classified joint task force. I hunted phantoms. I dismantled international syndicates that moved billions in illegal narcotics and human trafficking rings. I stepped away from that shadow world because the darkness had started to consume my soul. I wanted the boring desk job. I wanted the quiet house in Denver. I chose obscurity to protect my sanity, and I was not going to let a loudmouthed fraud pull me back into the abyss over a bruised ego. But Marcus was relentless. By the end of the week, a heavy black envelope arrived in our mail. Inside was a pair of VIP access passes to a wealth generation summit Marcus was hosting at a premium downtown hotel. Clipped to my ticket was a handwritten note on expensive stationery. It read, "Bring your wife. Maybe she can finally open her eyes and learn how the real world works." Julian held the tickets with trembling hands. He looked at me, his eyes brimming with a pathetic mixture of hope and fear. "Please, Addison," he begged, his voice cracking slightly. "I know he is arrogant. I know he insulted you. But I am drowning here. My firm needs his capital injection by the end of the month, or I have to fire 20 people. If we do not show up, he will cut me off completely. Just come with me. Just sit in the audience and let him feel important." I looked at the desperation etched deep into my husband's face. He was a good man, but he was painfully naive. He thought he was walking into a business deal, but I knew he was stepping directly into a slaughterhouse. "Okay," I said softly. "I will go." Julian let out a massive sigh of relief and pulled me into a tight hug, but my mind was already miles away. At 2 o'clock in the morning, while Julian slept heavily in our bedroom, I slipped quietly down the stairs and entered the dark basement. I moved behind the old bookshelves, feeling the cold concrete wall until my fingers found the loose brick. I slid it out and reached into the hidden cavity, retrieving a heavy, dust-covered metal lockbox. I carried it to the workbench, entered a complex 12-digit sequence into the keypad, and popped the lid. Resting inside on a bed of dark foam was an offline, military-grade encrypted solid-state drive. It had not been powered on in 5 years. I connected the drive to a secure, untraceable laptop I kept hidden in the floorboards. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh, pale blue light across my face in the pitch-black room as the complex decryption protocols began rolling down the monitor. A familiar, icy calm washed over my veins. The quiet, submissive wife who took insults at dinner was gone. The predator had finally woken up. The grand ballroom of the downtown hotel was packed to the brim with over 500 attendees. I wore a plain gray blazer over a simple black dress, intentionally vanishing into the sea of graying hair and hopeful, anxious faces. I sat quietly in the middle of the third row, taking a cold, analytical inventory of the demographics surrounding me. The median age in this room had to be around 65 to 70 years old. These were not sophisticated venture capitalists, institutional bankers, or high-risk day traders. These were retired public school teachers, former factory workers, and widowed grandparents clutching their life savings. It was a highly calculated, predatory hunting ground painted in cheap gold trim and blinding stage lights. Marcus paced the center of the stage with the manic, hyperactive energy of a late-night television evangelist. Behind him, massive digital screens flashed colorful, rising charts showing absurd financial returns of over 40% annually. He spoke smoothly and relentlessly about total financial liberation, weaving a hypnotic web of technical buzzwords designed entirely to confuse and disarm the cautious, vulnerable minds of the elderly audience. About 45 minutes into his bombastic presentation, he abruptly stopped pacing. His eyes scanned the front rows and locked directly onto my plain gray blazer. A vicious, predatory grin stretched across his face. He quickly signaled the lighting technician at the back of the room, and suddenly, a bright, intensely intrusive spotlight hit my seat. Hundreds of heads turned simultaneously to stare at me. "Look closely, folks," Marcus announced into his microphone. his voice echoing loudly off the high vaulted ceilings. "I want to talk to you tonight about the poverty mindset. Right here in the third row, we have a classic textbook example. This woman works a safe, boring desk job. She gets a tiny, predictable paycheck every 2 weeks and genuinely thinks she is secure. She is exactly the kind of person the traditional financial system wants you to be: afraid, compliant, unimaginative. She is entirely too scared to take a real risk and grab the true wealth that is waiting for you all." A low murmur of pity and soft derision rippled through the audience. Julian, sitting right next to me, visibly shrank down in his heavily padded chair, his face burning bright red in the harsh light. He stared intently at his lap, utterly paralyzed by the humiliation of being publicly associated with a failure. But I felt absolutely no anger. The spotlight was blindingly bright, but it illuminated exactly what I needed to see. While Marcus continued his loud, theatrical character assassination, my eyes shifted away from his smug face and locked onto the giant presentation screen directly behind his head. He was displaying a massive flowchart intended to demonstrate how his proprietary investment algorithm supposedly moved capital seamlessly through international markets. To the untrained eye of a retired teacher, it was just a complex, impressive web of arrows and corporate acronyms. To me, it was a signed confession. He was so incredibly arrogant, so thoroughly convinced of his own invincibility, that he had used actual, structural diagrams of his financial infrastructure for the slide deck. He had poorly redacted a series of 9-digit routing numbers and left the distinct registration prefixes of his offshore holding entities fully visible on the screen. I did not blink. I sat perfectly still, painting a picture of a humiliated wife, letting his insults wash over me while my eidetic memory permanently captured every single alphanumeric string glowing on that stage. I meticulously cataloged the banking identification codes, the localized registry tags of shell companies located in the British Virgin Islands, and the exact digital timestamps of his alleged fund transfers. The second the seminar finally ended, I excused myself, telling Julian I had a severe migraine, and drove straight home alone. I locked the heavy basement door behind me, shut off the overhead lights, and sat back down at my hidden terminal. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, moving with a fluid, terrifying speed that had been entirely dormant for half a decade. I completely bypassed standard internet protocols, diving directly into the encrypted, lawless underbelly of global financial networks. Using the specific routing fragments I had memorized from his arrogant presentation, I deployed a silent, highly aggressive, non-invasive digital tracker. It was a phantom script designed to slip through his cheap commercial firewalls like water pouring through a broken net. Within 40 minutes, the encrypted data started flooding back to my servers, filling my dual monitors with raw, undeniable truth. The logic of his network architecture was cold, precise, and completely disgusting. There was no proprietary algorithm. There was no decentralized finance revolution. Marcus was operating a massive textbook Ponzi scheme on an industrial scale. He was taking fresh capital directly from the elderly attendees at his seminars and using a tiny fraction of it to pay fake dividends to his older investors, desperately keeping the illusion alive while siphoning the rest into private accounts. But that was not the worst part. As I aggressively traced the flow of the stolen pension funds, following the digital breadcrumbs through 3 different offshore laundering layers, I hit a sudden, chilling roadblock. The money was bleeding back into the United States through a very specific, carefully constructed conduit. I executed a forceful bypass command and pulled up the corporate registration documents for the receiving domestic accounts. The screen immediately displayed the exact legal name of Julian's commercial real estate firm. My breath caught sharply in my throat, the cold air of the basement suddenly feeling incredibly thin. Marcus was not investing in Julian to help him save his business. Marcus was deliberately, methodically, setting up my husband's struggling development projects as the final washing machine for tens of millions of dollars of stolen retirement money. When the federal authorities inevitably caught wind of the massive fraud, the undeniable trail of dirty money would lead directly to Julian's desk. Marcus was building a legal firewall out of my husband's life, preparing to let Julian take the fall and face 20 years in a federal penitentiary while Marcus vanished flawlessly into the wind with the offshore accounts. The quiet, passive life I had tried so desperately to protect was officially over. The storm was no longer approaching. It was already inside my house. I cornered Julian in the bedroom early the next morning. He was frantically adjusting his silk tie in the mirror, the finalized partnership contract resting heavily on the unmade bed. The air in the room was thick with a suffocating, nervous energy. He was literally minutes away from driving to the firm and signing his life away. "Julian, you absolutely cannot sign that document," I said, my voice sharp and demanding, stripping away the gentle tone I usually reserved for him. "You need to cancel the meeting. You need to cut all ties with Marcus immediately. That entire portfolio is a death trap." He froze, staring at my reflection in the mirror before spinning around, his face instantly twisting into a mask of pure outrage. "Are we really doing this again, Addison? Today? Of all days?" "I am telling you, that money is not clean," I pressed, stepping closer to the bed, physically blocking his path to the physical contract. "If you merge your commercial real estate assets with his offshore shell companies, you are going to lose everything. He is not a legitimate partner. Julian. He is a parasite looking for a host to take the fall." "Enough!" Julian shouted, his voice cracking with a violent, terrifying frustration I had never heard from him before. He shoved past me, snatching the thick stack of papers off the mattress with shaking hands. "I am sick and entirely tired of your endless negativity. Just because you are content living a completely stagnant life, working a dead-end desk job, does not mean I have to fail with you. You are jealous. You are so deeply insecure about anyone else achieving actual, massive success that you would rather see my firm go completely bankrupt than admit Marcus is a winner." The words struck like physical blows, but I did not flinch. I watched the man I loved essentially beg to walk into a federal prison. He stormed out of the room, slamming the bedroom door so violently the picture frames on the hallway wall rattled. The heavy silence that followed was entirely suffocating. The tiny crack in our marriage had just fractured into a massive, unbridgeable chasm. I realized in that exact moment that trying to reason with him was a complete waste of time. Marcus had him thoroughly, hopelessly brainwashed. If I wanted to keep my husband out of a concrete cell for the next 20 years, I had to completely dismantle the predator's organization myself, and I had to do it completely behind Julian's back. The danger was so immediate, I could barely breathe. The second Julian's car pulled out of the driveway, I ran back down to the dark, isolated basement. The clock was ticking violently in my head. I had a rapidly shrinking window before Julian legally bound himself to the massive laundering operation. I sat down at the encrypted terminal and immediately went to work. I spent the next 7 straight hours meticulously compiling a terrifyingly flawless digital dossier. I gathered every single trace of Marcus's offshore routing numbers, the fake dividend distributions, the stolen pension fund ledgers, and the direct digital pathways connecting the stolen cash to Julian's corporate accounts. I organized the chaotic data into a brutal, undeniable narrative of wire fraud and grand larceny. I then initiated a deeply buried, secure communication protocol I had not used in over 5 years. I routed the massive, heavily encrypted file through 7 different global proxy servers located in hostile jurisdictions, effectively making my origin entirely untraceable. Finally, I dropped the package directly into the highly classified priority inbox of the Federal Cyber Investigations Division. I knew exactly which senior director would see it, and I knew that once they verified the staggering multi-million-dollar scale of the theft, they would have absolutely no choice but to deploy an immediate, heavily armed tactical strike. But Marcus was moving just as frantically. That evening, Julian returned home looking pale, sweaty, and utterly exhausted. The business contract was signed, but the nightmare was far from over. Julian collapsed onto the living room sofa and buried his face heavily in his shaking hands. "Marcus is hosting a massive, exclusive investment gala tomorrow night," Julian mumbled, his voice trembling with a terrifying blend of absolute fear and blind faith. "It is a closed-door event for his absolute highest-tier clients. He told me that to finalize the massive capital transfer for my firm, I have to prove my personal, unquestionable liquidity. He is demanding we wire all of our personal life savings, every single penny we have in the bank, into his master holding account by tomorrow night. If we do not, he kills the deal immediately and leaves my firm to die." My blood ran entirely cold. It was the final, desperate squeeze. Marcus was trying to drain the absolute last drop of blood from his vulnerable victims before cutting the cord and disappearing with the stolen money. The pressure in the room was physically crushing. "I have to do it. Addison," Julian whispered, looking up at me with dead, completely defeated eyes. "I am transferring the funds tomorrow morning. He expects us both at the grand ballroom at 8 o'clock sharp. Please, just stand by me one last time." He was handing over our entire future to a ghost. The suffocating weight in the room was unbearable, a physical pressure pressing tightly down on my chest. But amidst that crushing, imminent danger, a cold, crystal-clear resolve settled over my mind. The federal agents had the damning dossier. The inescapable trap was set. Now, I just needed to make sure the arrogant rat stayed perfectly still until the steel cage snapped shut. "I will be there," I said quietly, my voice giving absolutely nothing away. I left Julian weeping silently on the couch and walked slowly up the stairs. I bypassed my usual selection of comfortable, invisible clothing. I reached deep into the very back of my closet and pulled out a garment I had not touched in years. It was a floor-length, deep emerald silk gown, sharp, elegant, and entirely unapologetic. I paired it with a set of 3-inch black stiletto heels and a heavy silver necklace. I was completely done wearing the cheap wool cardigans. I was done shrinking quietly into the background to make small men feel big. Tomorrow night, Marcus was expecting a weak, submissive wife to quietly hand over her family's life savings. Instead, he was going to get an executioner. I was going to walk directly into his glittering fake fortress and burn it entirely to the ground. The grand ballroom of the Platinum-tier country club was an absolute masterpiece of fake opulence. Crystal chandeliers the size of small vehicles hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a blinding fragmented light over elaborate ice sculptures and towering displays of imported champagne. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with well-dressed attendees, the air humming with the loud, chaotic energy of desperate greed mixing with blind hope. I walked into the venue holding Julian's arm. He was sweating profusely in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his mind entirely consumed by the massive, irreversible wire transfer he had authorized just 3 hours ago. I looked around the room and felt a deep, sickening twist in my stomach. Beneath the expensive suits and evening gowns, I saw the exact same vulnerable demographic from the seminar. These were not sophisticated billionaires. They were retired engineers, former nurses, and elderly small business owners who had mortgaged their completely paid-off homes to chase Marcus's impossible promises. They were standing around laughing and drinking, blissfully unaware that they were preparing to hand over their absolute last financial lifeline to a ruthless predator. My deep emerald silk gown moved like liquid glass as I navigated through the crowded floor. I did not hide in the dark corners tonight. I walked with my spine perfectly straight, my tall stiletto heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. The sudden shift in my demeanor was impossible to ignore. Several conversations paused as I walked past, heads turning to take in the cold, commanding presence that had completely replaced the quiet, unassuming desk clerk they thought they knew. It did not take long for Marcus to spot me. He was standing on a raised wooden dais at the front of the room, holding a gold-plated microphone and holding court before a large crowd of adoring victims. He was wearing a custom dark velvet dinner jacket, his face flushed with expensive alcohol and the absolute thrill of his impending escape. When his eyes locked onto mine, his arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Briefly confused by the sharp, undeniable confidence radiating from me, but his monstrous ego quickly recovered. He saw an immediate opportunity for one final, devastating public humiliation before he vanished forever. Well. Marcus's voice boomed through the massive concert-grade speakers, instantly cutting through the noisy chatter of the ballroom. Look who finally decided to dress up and join the real world. The entire room fell completely silent. 500 pairs of eyes shifted from the stage to where I stood in the center aisle. Julian instantly let go of my arm and took a horrified step backward, his face draining of all blood. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus continued, his tone dripping with toxic, theatrical sarcasm, "please give a warm welcome to Julian's lovely wife, Addison. You might remember her from our seminar. She works a very important, very boring desk job pushing data for a living. Since she considers herself such a brilliant financial analyst, I think it is only fair we let her verify my portfolio." He stepped to the absolute edge of the stage, leaning down slightly, gesturing with his free hand. "Come on up here, Addison. Come up to the microphone. I challenge you right here, right now, in front of all my elite partners, to audit my greatness. Tell everyone in this room exactly why they should not trust a man who has generated 40% returns for 3 straight years." A low collective chuckle rippled through the older crowd. They genuinely thought it was a joke. They thought the king of the room was playfully swatting an annoying fly. I did not hesitate. I did not shrink down. I stepped forward, walking slowly and deliberately down the center aisle. The rhythmic sound of my heels echoed like a heavy metronome counting down to his absolute destruction. I climbed the short flight of stairs to the dais, my emerald dress sweeping elegantly over the plush stage carpet. I stopped less than 2 feet away from Marcus. I looked directly into his eyes. Up close, under the harsh stage lights, I could see the tiny beads of sweat forming on his forehead. The king was finally starting to realize the fly was actually a poisonous hornet. I calmly reached out and took the gold-plated microphone directly from his damp hand. He relinquished it without a single fight. Too stunned by my complete lack of fear to react defensively, I turned to face the massive crowd. The silence in the room was now heavy, expectant, and incredibly tense. I raised the microphone to my lips. I did not shout. I spoke in a clear, resonant, and entirely merciless voice that projected perfectly across the silent ballroom. "Account number 749-221-8, I began, enunciating every single syllable with terrifying precision. "Registered to a synthetic holding shell located in Nassau, Bahamas. Current balance, $22,450,000. Last access timestamp, 4 hours and 12 minutes ago. Requested via a secure virtual private network bouncing through a server in Geneva." The collective chuckle in the room vanished instantly. The air grew suddenly freezing cold. Marcus physically took a step back, his eyes widening in absolute, unfiltered horror. "Account number 903-445-1, I continued, my voice steady, relentless, and completely dominant. "Registered under a false corporate umbrella in the British Virgin Islands. Current balance, $31,800,000. Status, currently holding pending wire transfers initiated exactly 3 hours ago by over 40 individuals sitting in this very room." "Stop!" Marcus gasped, his voice barely a whisper, completely unamplified and pathetically weak. He reached out with a trembling hand to grab the microphone back, but I smoothly stepped just out of his reach, my eyes remaining locked entirely on the terrified audience. "The proprietary trading algorithm you were all sold does not exist," I announced, the truth crashing over the crowd like a heavy wave of ice. "There are no decentralized finance yields. There are no high-frequency arbitrage returns. The money you deposited last month was simply used to pay the fake dividends of the people who deposited 6 months ago. The man standing trembling behind me is operating a massive, catastrophic Ponzi scheme. And tonight, he intended to drain the final $90 million of your collective retirement funds, including the complete life savings of my husband, and disappear to a non-extradition country by tomorrow morning. The silence that followed was not just quiet. It was a dead, suffocating vacuum. The elderly victims in the audience stared at me, their faces twisting from deep confusion to sheer, unadulterated terror as the reality of their ruined lives began to fully sink in. Julian was standing near the back wall, clutching his chest, breathing heavily as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of his lungs. Then, the heavy vacuum violently shattered. "She is lying!" Marcus suddenly screamed, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. His face was entirely purple with blinding rage and pure panic. He lunged forward, wildly waving his arms at the crowd. "She is a crazy, jealous, pathetic desk clerk. She is completely fabricating every single word. Security, get this insane woman off my stage right now. She is actively trying to ruin my life." He was shouting at the top of his lungs, but nobody moved to help him. The security guards stood completely frozen. The crowd was entirely paralyzed. The only sound in the massive ballroom was Marcus's frantic, heavy breathing echoing off the crystal chandeliers. I slowly lowered the microphone to my side. I looked at Marcus, offering him a perfectly calm, icy smile. I did not need to say another single word. My part of the execution was entirely complete. I slowly raised my left wrist and glanced calmly at my watch. It was exactly 8:15 in the evening. Less than 1 second later, a deafening crash violently shook the entire structural foundation of the hotel. The massive, heavy oak double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom did not just simply open, they completely shattered inward, blown completely off their thick iron hinges by a specialized tactical battering ram. The noise was absolutely catastrophic. Before anyone in the room could even process the violent explosion, a massive flood of heavily armed federal agents poured into the ballroom. They were wearing dark, heavy tactical body armor, their assault rifles raised, and bright tactical flashlights cutting sharply through the dim, elegant lighting of the venue. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, nobody move! Keep your hands exactly where we can see them," a booming, authoritative voice commanded over a heavy external megaphone. Dozens of elite agents fanned out instantly, securing all the emergency exits and locking down the entire perimeter with flawless, terrifying military precision. The crowd screamed and scattered, wealthy investors diving under tables and dropping their champagne glasses to the hard marble floor in pure, unbridled panic. It was absolute, glorious chaos, meticulously orchestrated and arriving exactly on the exact second I had calculated. I stood perfectly still on the raised stage, entirely untouched by the panic, watching the federal net finally, completely close around the screaming, thrashing monster who honestly thought he was entirely untouchable. 3 heavily armored tactical agents vaulted onto the wooden dais. Before Marcus could even take a single breath, he tried to scramble backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the polished wood. As he let out a pathetic, high-pitched yelp, they grabbed his custom velvet dinner jacket, tearing the delicate fabric, and slammed him aggressively face first onto his own podium. The sharp, heavy click of solid steel handcuffs snapping tightly around his wrists echoed through the dropped microphone still resting on the floor. Local investigative journalists, who always trailed quietly behind major federal raid units, flooded through the shattered double doors right behind the tactical team. Blinding white flashes from dozens of heavy press cameras illuminated the stage, permanently capturing the total, humiliating collapse of his fake billionaire mask. Marcus was actively weeping, his face completely pressed against the hard stage floor. When the Supreme Commander of the Federal Cyber Division stepped up onto the dais, he was a massive, imposing man wearing a heavy tactical vest adorned with bold gold lettering. The commander entirely ignored the crying, broken fraud on the floor. Instead, he walked directly over to where I was standing in my emerald gown. To the absolute shock of the remaining crowd, the massive commander stopped right in front of me, squared his broad shoulders, and offered a deep, highly respectful bow of his head. "The entire perimeter is perfectly secured. Senior Investigative Director Bishop," the commander stated loudly, his deep voice carrying a rare tone of absolute reverence. "Your anonymous data packet was entirely flawless. We have effectively frozen all offshore assets and secured the stolen funds. Thank you for coming out of retirement to hand us this ghost." Down on the main floor, Julian stood completely frozen, his jaw physically hanging open. His eyes darted wildly between my calm face and the heavily armed federal commander treating me like absolute royalty. The sheer magnitude of my hidden life crashed over my husband like a crushing physical weight, paralyzing him in pure, unadulterated shock. Marcus was violently hoisted to his feet by the agents, his tear-stained, swollen face twisted in ultimate despair as he looked directly at me. The agonizing realization finally shattered his arrogant mind. The quiet, compliant woman he had relentlessly mocked over salmon and wine was the exact same apex predator who had effortlessly written his absolute death sentence. He was dragged out of the grand ballroom, kicking and screaming, a completely broken man heading toward a concrete cell for the rest of his natural life. 3 days later, the violent storm had finally passed. The night air in Denver was quiet and soothingly cool. I sat in the dim, unlit living room of our house, watching the pale moonlight dance across the walls. Julian walked in slowly, carrying 2 mugs of warm chamomile tea. He sat down heavily in the armchair directly across from me. He looked deeply exhausted, but the frantic, desperate energy that had infected his spirit for months was entirely gone. "I am so incredibly sorry," Julian whispered, his voice thick with a bitter, profound shame. "I completely mistook your silence for weakness. I thought you were just a passive clerk hiding from the world. I never realized you were simply choosing to be kind to me." I looked at my husband, feeling the heavy, lingering tension finally leave my tired shoulders. "Julian," I said gently, ensuring my words carried absolutely no anger or resentment. "True, absolute power never actually needs to shout. It does not need loud suits or flashy watches to prove it exists. I chose this quiet, ordinary life with you because I was entirely exhausted from spending my days destroying ruthless people like Marcus. I did not want to be a weapon anymore. I just wanted peace." Julian stared at me for a long time, heavy tears silently pooling in his eyes. He slowly leaned forward and reached across the dark space between us. He took my hand, his grip firm, steady, and overflowing with a newly discovered, boundless respect. He finally understood the deep, terrifying, and beautiful strength of the woman sitting beside him. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Violet Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we would love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you are listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.